What's going on, APUSH students? This is Mr. Bristol, and the purpose of this video is to give you a general, actually quite specific overview of what you need to know for the DBQ portion of the AP US History exam. Of course, DBQ stands for Document-Based Question. And so if you follow along, I'll go through every single piece of information you need, hopefully to help you knock this section of the exam out of the park. All right. So to start off with, what is a DBQ? So the easiest way to think about a DBQ, and I think the most useful way to do so, is it is just a 5-paragraph essay, a simple five-paragraph essay, the kind of thing you've been doing since, I don't know, 6th grade or something like that. You have a introductory paragraph, you have 3 supporting paragraphs, and you have a conclusion. Now, we're going to make it a lot more complicated than that, but, well, we're not. College Board is, and we're going to explain that. But it's useful to just kind of have that in your head as far as, okay, this is essentially what I'm doing. This is how I'm structuring it, right? So it's a 5-paragraph essay. It's an argumentative essay. So you have to put forth an argument, and then you have to defend that argument with evidence. All right. So you will be given a prompt, the question that you're supposed to answer, and you will be given 7 documents, primary source documents, secondary source documents, and these documents can range from things like excerpts from speeches, excerpts from letters, political cartoons, graphs, charts, excerpts from Supreme Court cases, from amendments, from pieces of legislation. It runs the gamut. There's a wide range of things that they could be, but they will give you 7, all of which will be focused on a singular topic, which of course is what your prompt is going to be asking you about. I'll introduce a sample prompt in a moment here. So you will then need to use those 7 documents as your evidence to prove your argument. Right? So it's a 5-paragraph essay. You have an intro, you have 3 supporting paragraphs, you have a conclusion. In those 3 supporting paragraphs, you need to include evidence to support your argument, and you will need to use the 7 documents they give you, and I'll tell you exactly how to do that, in order to prove, as evidence to prove your argument. You will have 60 minutes to complete the DBQ, 1 full hour. It is strongly recommended that there's a typo on here, so forgive me for that, but that you take 15 minutes to read the documents and outline your essay. Forget about that and, that was a typo. You have 15 minutes to read through your 7 documents and then outline your essay. And I'm going to just emphasize the outline your essay piece because it is my very strong contention that it is impossible to write a good argumentative essay if you have not outlined it. You must outline it. It's like having a roadmap that lets you know where you're going. One of the biggest mistakes that students make when they're writing these things is they just start writing without knowing where they're going. And it's very clear to the person reading your essay when you realize halfway through that you were going in one direction and then you remembered something else and you switch directions and go in a different direction, and the whole thing is kind of chaotic and does not have kind of a central direction that it's going. So having one organized, thoughtful outline before you start writing is monumentally important. But anyway, so you have about 15 minutes to read through those 7 documents and to outline your essay. Then you'll have 45 minutes to actually write the essay, right? Write the 5-paragraph essay. All right. And there's a whole bunch of terms that are going to come in this next part that I'll explain in way more detail as we move through this video. But this is the basic breakdown of how your 5-paragraph essay will look. So you'll see paragraph number 1 is going to be your introduction. In your introduction, you will do contextualization. I'll explain that later. And you will have a thesis statement. I'll explain that later. In paragraphs 2, 3, and 4, you'll notice those are all the exact same thing. You'll have 3 supporting paragraphs. Each one of those supporting paragraphs will focus on a singular idea that supports the thesis. The thesis is where you state your argument. Your supporting paragraphs are where you make your argument. So if I'm going to make the claim that Aladdin is the single greatest Disney movie ever created, that is me stating an argument. I then need to come up with 3 reasons why that's the case. Then I have to have evidence to support those reasons, et cetera, et cetera. So in paragraph number 2, you're going to have one specific idea that supports your overall thesis, and you're going to include evidence including the documents that they give you and outside evidence, and you will have to HIPP the documents they give you. Again, I'll explain that later on. In paragraph number 3, you'll do the exact same thing, but with a secondary topic that supports your thesis. In paragraph number 4, you'll do the exact same thing, but with a third topic that supports your thesis. So if I were to go with my Aladdin is the single greatest Disney movie ever created, you know, in my first paragraph was that it has the best soundtrack of Disney movies, any Disney movie. The second paragraph is that the genie is the most hilarious you know, kind of sidekick character of any Disney movie. And the third paragraph is, you know, that Jafar is, you know, the single most evil, you know, villain in any Disney movie, whatever, right? It's 3 different ideas, but all of which support my overall contention that Aladdin is the single greatest Disney movie of all time. All right. Then your 5th paragraph is your conclusion. And in your conclusion, you are going to do something that College Board calls complexity, which is very complex, but I'll explain that later on. So this is basically the way that it all lays out. It's a 5-paragraph essay. Each of those paragraphs, there's an expectation of what you're supposed to do. Now, let me give you a warning from the top. It is important that you know that good DBQ writing is actually kind of bad writing. That the way that you have to write your DBQ is not actually good writing. It's very different than what you might do in an English class. This is going to be a very formulaic process. You're going to be just punching things in order to be able to check off the boxes that College Board wants you to check off. So if you're writing a DBQ and you feel like, God, this doesn't feel like it's Shakespeare or poetry or some sort of, you know, well-worded, you know, piece of literature, it's not supposed to be, right? It's not supposed to be. It's really just kind of you checking boxes and moving through. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about some of those terms in a moment. But first, let's talk about how you earn those 7 points. So contextualization, again, more detail later. You get 1 point for that. Thesis, more details later. You get 1 point for that. Evidence overall, you get 3 points for evidence. Actually, let me take a step back. I'll remind you, contextualization and thesis both go in your introductory paragraph. So 2 of your 7 points come from your introductory paragraph. Okay. Then there are 3 points for evidence overall. And those 3 points all will come from those 3 supporting paragraphs. You will get 2 points for how you use the documents, if you use the documents correctly, and you will get 1 point for bringing in outside evidence. And again, more detail on these to come. So, and that will all come in your 3 supporting paragraphs. So 2 points from your intro, 3 points from your 3 supporting paragraphs by use of evidence. But then there will also be a 4th point, which comes in the analysis and reasoning scoring category for sourcing the documents. And that will be something you will also do in your supporting paragraphs. This is what I referred to on the previous slide as hipping the doc. Hipping the document and sourcing your documents is the same thing. I'll explain that later on. So your evidence and your sourcing of the documents, aka hipping the documents, all will happen within your supporting paragraphs and will get you a total of 4 points. So if you do your contextualization and your thesis and your introduction, if you use all of your documents and you do with those documents what College Board wants you to do, and you bring in outside information, and you source those documents, you will now have a 6 out of 7 if you've done all of those things correctly. The last point comes from something called complexity, and we'll put that in our concluding paragraph. That is a complicated point, and I will tell you right now that as I've looked around online, I've gotten from some pretty reliable resources that only 2% of AP students actually get the complexity point. It's nearly impossible to get, but I will give you a tip about how I've learned might be the easiest and best way to go about doing that, but we'll do that in the conclusion. All right, so let's move forward. Okay, so before we get into all those things, I'm going to give you a sample prompt of what a DBQ, of what might come on your DBQ, and then we could use that as we move through as as we explain each of the pieces. So let's say, and this is an actual prompt from College Board, that you sit down to do the DBQ, you open it up, and the prompt says, evaluate the extent to which the progressive movement fostered political change in the United States from 1890 to 1920. Now, the first thing I will tell you is that you should read the prompts not once, not twice, but thrice. Because if you misunderstand the question, and this is all too common, if you misunderstand the question and you're often running on writing some DBQ or 5-paragraph essay that answers the question you thought you read but was not the actual question, then you are just shooting yourself in the foot. There is no chance you're going to be able to do that, right? So if you say, evaluate the extent to which the progressive movement fostered change in the United States from 1890 to 1920, cool, let's go, and you miss the political part, then you're in trouble, right? Or if you say, evaluate the extent to which progressive movement fostered political change in the United States, okay, cool, let's go. And you start talking about things that happened during the New Deal, because that was quite progressive, although it's not technically really a progressive movement, you're missing the point. So or even if you miss what they're actually asking you to do, it's asking you to evaluate the extent. So if you just kind of rush through that, read through it 3 times. It only is going to take you about 10 seconds to read it 3 times. Read through it 3 times, underline words you think are important, circle words you think are important. Well, I guess if you're doing this online, that's not really there, but just in your mind, circle or underline things you think are important. Because as you're reading the prompt, there are 3 things you're looking for that you want to make sure you are taking note of. The first thing that you're looking for in a prompt is the theme. What is the general theme of the prompt? There's many themes in American history, right? There's foreign policy, there's social change, there's rights and discrimination, there's the list goes on and on. There's probably somewhere between 7 to 10 different themes. In this question, you could see it is asking about political change. That's the theme. That's the theme. So that's why it's important that you make sure you read through the prompts multiple times so you know exactly what the theme is. So you're not going off and writing about the social aspects of progressivism. You're not going off and writing about the economic aspects of progressivism or whatever, cultural aspects, whatever it is. This question is specifically asking about political change. So that's the first thing you're looking for in your prompt. The second thing you're looking for in your prompt is your time period. And this is something that is one of the dumbest ways that students lose points on these types of DBQ essays, is they write about stuff outside of the time period given. Now, not every single prompt gives you a time period, but most of them do. And sometimes they won't give you from this year to this year. Sometimes they'll just name a period, right? In the antebellum period of America. Well, if you know history, the antebellum period is basically the 1800s prior to the Civil War. So they may not say 1800 to 1860, but that's basically what you need to know that it is, right? Or if they say in the New Deal era, okay, well, they didn't say, from 1932 to 1940 or whatever. But if you know when the New Deal era is, you know that you should keep your answer within that time period. But boy, oh boy, if you take one of your supporting paragraphs and focus on something that comes outside that time period, again, you're shooting yourself in the foot, right? The third thing you're looking for in the prompt is trying to figure out what is it actually asking you to do. Now, there's basically kind of 4 different styles of DBQ questions, 4 different questions that you could be asked. One is a compare and contrast question. One is a causation question. One is a change or continuity over time question. And one is a periodization question. Every single DBQ will be one of those. So make sure you understand what they're asking, because if it's a periodization question and you start doing compare and contrast, again, you're not doing what they're actually asking you to do. If it's a causation question and you're doing periodization, you're not actually doing what they're asking you to do. Now, what do all these things mean? Okay, so compare and contrast, I think we're all pretty familiar with that concept, but basically it's going to be a question where they're asking you, how are these things the same or different? So that might be a situation where they're asking you to compare and contrast the American economy in the 1920s and the 1950s, or they're asking you to compare and contrast the effectiveness of the women's rights movement in the 19-teens versus the 1970s. So in that situation, you're going to say, okay, how are these things similar and how are these things different? And you're going to kind of set up your entire essay to focus on similarities and differences between those 2 different times. Now, usually what that would mean is that you'd set up one paragraph talk about similarities, one paragraph to talk about differences, and the third paragraph maybe to talk about which one was more effective. Or you could talk about how they were similar and different in one aspect in paragraph one, how they were similar and different in a different aspect in paragraph two, and how they were similar and different in a third aspect in paragraph three. That how you choose to do that is going to be dependent on the documents you're given. I'll talk more about that later on. But anyway, compare and contrast, that's pretty straightforward. Causation is what were the causes and effects of historical events. So it might be, asking you to look at what were the things that led to the American Civil War. So you're looking at the Missouri Compromise in 1820. You're looking at the annexation of Texas. You're looking at the Mexican-American War, compromise in 1850, Bleeding Kansas. There's a whole bunch of things that happened in the 1800s that led up to the Civil War. So in that type of a question, you're not comparing or contrasting anything, right? You're talking about what were the things that led to this event, or conversely, what things did this event lead to? So it might be, in what ways did World War II create new opportunities for different groups of previously discriminated against Americans or something like that. So now you see that World War II is going to cause all of these changes to happen, right? Or how did World War II affect America on the home front, right? So we know World War II led to the Great Migration, and we know World War II led to more of a women's labor movement because more and more women were going to work, that kind of thing. So how did one thing lead to the other, right? The next thing is continuity and change over time. How much has something changed or stayed the same, right? So this might be confuses a little bit with causation. So causation is how did A lead to B, right? So A and B are two different things, but A led to B, or basically. Continuity and change over time is going to ask you to really think about, in kind of you're thinking about the rights and privileges of African Americans in the United States. So, looking at how things progressed or didn't between Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Movement. It's not asking how Reconstruction led to the Civil Rights Movement. That would be causation. It's not asking you to compare Reconstruction to the Civil Rights Movement. That'd be compare and contrast. It's how did things change over time, or how did they stay the same over time? And then the last type of question is periodization. Is this a turning point in history? Is this thing that we're looking at right here, whatever the thing is it something that we can say there's a before and after? And I kind of emphasize this a lot when I talk to often about kind of like why chapters begin and end on specific years, usually, and certainly units begin and end on specific years. Usually it's because there's a big thing that happened during that time period. So is Watergate a turning point in American history? Is the Vietnam War a turning point in American history? Those types of things, right? So you can look for clues in your prompt to see what they're actually asking you to do, and that can help you kind of figure out how you should approach the essay. So in our sample prompt, evaluate the extent to which the progressive movement fostered political change in the United States from 1890 to 1920. So first and foremost, if you look at theme, we know it's about political change. Secondly, if we're talking about time period, we know it's from 1890 to 1920. So we already know we're thinking about political change in this 30-year period from 1890 to 1920. But now we're going to look at what is it actually asking us to do. And I would say that this is a change or continuity over time. How much has something changed or stayed the same? It's saying evaluate the extent to which the progressive movement fostered political change. So how much political change actually happened between 1890 and 1920 as a result of the progressive movement? So that's really what the question's asking you. So once you've read the prompt 3 times and you say, okay, it's asking me whether or not there's been political change, also could be read as governmental change in this 30-year period. Now let me go and look at the documents to see what they've given me, right? Because the documents are going to be evidence I have to use to prove my point. So I would argue that you could start to think about what argument you want to make at this point. Okay, well, I think there was political change during this time period. I'm starting to think about this stuff and so on and so forth. But don't get too deep into forming an argument or forming a thesis until you've looked at your documents, because the documents are really the thing that are going to guide you. Those are the things that are going to lead you in the direction that you should go. You can start to get some idea of what you think makes sense, and then look at the documents and then let them kind of solidify that for you to a certain degree. But the worst thing you could do is have a very specific idea of where you want to take the essay, and you look at the documents and they don't in any way match where you were going to go. So now you're either trying to force these documents into an essay where they don't belong, which won't work, or you have to scramble to change your entire idea before you go. So you should not have outlined anything yet. You should not have written a thesis yet until you've looked at the documents. All right. So let's talk about how you get them points. So point number one is for contextualization. Well, actually, let me take one more quick step back and just kind of further drive home this point, because I do think it's worth lingering on for a quick second longer. The way that you should think about how your time is going to be used is you open up the DBQ, you read the prompt, you read it a second time, you read it a third time, and you now have a very clear sense of what's the theme. Is it political? Is it social? Is it foreign policy? Is it economic? Is it whatever? Or is it multiple themes? Sometimes it could be multiple themes. What's the time period they're asking me to look at? And what are they actually asking me to do? Once you got all that figured out, then you're going to look at the documents. And I may say there may be a point, I don't remember exactly, maybe a point later on in this video where I talk about this in more detail, but I'm going to talk about it now just to be sure. Once you look at your documents, what you need to do is you have 7 documents. And you need to look at those documents and you need to try to find 3 categories that those documents can be organized into. Whatever the 3 different categories are that make sense based on those documents, just looking at them, they're intended to kind of fall into 3 categories. So then once you've said, okay, well, documents, 1, 3, and 7 fall into one specific category, that'll kind of be your category A, and the documents 2 and 4 fall into a specific another category that will be category B, and then the remaining documents. So for example, on this, to what extent did the progressive movement foster political change in the United States from 1890 to 1920? Maybe some of the documents relate to political change on a local level, maybe like political change in cities. Maybe some of the documents apply to political change at the state level, and maybe some of the documents apply to political change at the federal level. So now you can start to say, okay, well, I have a group of documents that are about local government, a group of documents about state government, a group of documents about federal government. Or maybe they're focused on different aspects of political change, right? So one would be about giving the people more power through the referendum, the recall, and the initiative. One would be about, changing the way that people are, one would be maybe about the 17th Amendment. So it'd be, okay, we're going to give people more power to be able to vote directly for their senators. And then there'd be some other document in there that talked about how people had more power to be able to choose who their governing officials were. And then there'd be, maybe 2 other documents that related to, some other aspect of kind of like maybe some other new way of regulating how the government operated. So it would still be 3 different, so I didn't have more of a clear example on the third one there, but it would still be 3 kind of different ideas that all relate to political change, but in kind of 3 different ways. So you'd organize your documents in that category. You would then take those 3 categories and establish your entire essay that way. So that supporting paragraph number 1 would be one category, and you would use all the documents there. Supporting paragraph number 2 would be category B, and you use all the relative documents there. Supporting paragraph C would be the 3rd category, and you'd use all the relative documents there. And then, of course, you would write your thesis in a way that sets up those 3. But we'll get to that in a moment. All right. I may have that later in here, and if I do, I can just run through it briefly because I already talked about it, but I just want to make sure I did talk about that. Okay, so how do you get the first point? First point comes from contextualization. I'll remind you that contextualization belongs in your intro paragraph. Contextualization is actually kind of the very first thing your reader will read. So if you go back to how we set up our 5-paragraph essay, first is contextualization, then is thesis. So if your introductory paragraph is 5 to 6 sentences, or even if it's 3 to 4 sentences, you will have 2 to 3 or maybe even 4 sentences of contextualization before you get to your thesis. Now, the first thing you do will be to write a thesis. That's the very first thing you're going to do. After you've organized your documents, after you've outlined your what your 3 supporting paragraphs are going to be, you're going to write your thesis, right? And you're going to have that kind of on notes or whatever. That's not what you're actually going to do in your essay. The first thing that you're going to write in your essay is contextualization. So what is contextualization? Contextualization puts your argument into a larger historical context, therefore contextualization. It explains relevant events from the previous time period that led to the topic of your essay. So the idea is that you shouldn't jump directly into the topic. You should ease into a little bit. The analogy I kind of use on this one sometimes is it's kind of like sometimes we'll see at the beginning of a movie or a TV show where it'll be like a bird's eye view of a town and the camera will slowly zoom in on a specific neighborhood and on a specific house and on the backyard and then zoom into kind of, a kid playing with a toy. So the more broad perspective that when this movie starts, okay, well, this takes place in suburbia because we have this big, long view of suburbia, and now it's going to zoom into this kid playing in the backyard or whatever, right? So that's kind of what you want to do here. You want to put the specific topic into a larger historical context. So if our sample prompt, once again, is evaluate the extent to which progressive movement fostered political change in the United States from 1890 to 1920, you want to think about, okay, what were the relevant political events that happened prior to 1890 that led to the progressive movements? And you really want to stay within 50 years, not really go too much farther beyond that. And the more recent, the better, right? So if we're talking about kind of the political change that happened in the progressive movement from 1890 to 1920, you really want to think about what politics were like in the 1870s and 1880s. And we know that there's a lot of corruption in government in the 1870s and 1880s. We know that by and large, the government had kind of just taken a huge step back and said, well, we'll just let big businesses do whatever they want to do. This is the era of the forgotten presidents. This is the time period in which big businesses reigned supreme, in which the captains of industry really kind of ran the show. And so if you can kind of talk about those ideas for about 3 or 2 would be fine, but 3 to 4 sentences before you get into your thesis, that's what you want to do, right? And then you want to connect it to your thesis. So the first 2 to 3 sentences, maybe 4 sentences of your introductory paragraph of your entire DBQ is going to be this contextualization. Then it'll lead into your thesis statement, which will be 1 or 2 sentences at the end of your intro. So your introductory paragraph is contextualization first, and then thesis. So you would say something along the lines of, in the aftermath of the Civil War, the Republican Party maintained absolute control over the federal government. However, during this time period, we saw a significant amount of corruption during this time period. And then you might name drop the the Teapot Dome scandal. Maybe I'm getting my scandal timeline mixed up, but you drop in the Teapot Dome scandal. You might drop in some of the other things. Then you could talk about how the captains of industry really were able to kind of reign supreme because the government was kind of MIA, right? So you would talk about these things. And what you want to do is you definitely want to include some specific key terms in that time period. You don't want to be too generic. So that's why I'm saying naming captains of industry or naming the specific scandals that happened during that time period would be good to not just have it be like super broad. Okay, so you've done that. You've written 2 to 3 to 4 sentences, depending on what you feel makes sense for your essay. Basically, leading into the why did the progressive movement happen? Why did we need political change in the progressive movement? What were the things that were happening before that led to that thing? So the way that I like to think about this is, how like sometimes you watch TV shows, and I don't know if they do this as much anymore on streaming, but like sometimes you like flip on an episode of a show and they'll spend the first 30 seconds with the previously on Gilmore Girls, and they'll like tell you all the things that happened in the last episode or even like throughout the season that are relevant to what's going to happen in this episode. So if like Rory's boyfriend is going to come back in this episode who we haven't seen since like last season, they might show you a short little clip of that guy from last season, so you're like, oh yeah, I remember that guy. Or if something happened in the previous episode where there was like a cliffhanger of like, I've actually never seen the show, so I kind of walked myself into a corner here. I don't have enough knowledge of Gilmore Girls. But anyway, something happened in the previous episode where like the mom and the daughter got into a big fight and like the daughter ran off. You want to remember that before you watch this episode. So it's telling you all the stuff that has happened prior to this point that is really important for you to know in order to understand this episode. So that's basically what contextualization is, right? Previously on American history, the Republican Party had pretty much complete control over the government. They were super corrupt. They let the captains of industry run the show. This led us into the Gilded Age. That'd be a really great term to throw in there. Led us into the Gilded Age, that kind of stuff, right? And then that leads you into your thesis. So that's contextualization. If you do that, you get that 1 point. You're 1/7 of the way to a perfect score. All right. Now I know you guys know how to write a thesis, but just in case, why not? So your thesis belongs at the end of your intro paragraph. As I said before, you do contextualization and it leads into your paragraph. So you start quite broad and then you lead in slowly into a more specific thesis statement. Now, the way to think about your thesis statement is this is where you are directly answering the question. So if somebody said, what is the single greatest Disney movie of all time? And my answer is Aladdin is the single greatest Disney movie of all time. That is my direct answer to the question. Now, that's not a good thesis, and I'll talk about why in a second, but that's what your thesis should be. It is you are directly responding to the prompt. So if our prompt, which I don't have on here, so I'll go back one slide, is evaluate the extent to which the progressive movement fostered political change in the United States from 1890 to 1920, you would then respond with your answer. And your answer could be, and this is kind of the whole idea with the evaluate the extent type of question. You can either say, yes, 100%. The progressive movement completely changed politics across the board. Absolutely, totally did. You can be, yeah, the answer on an evaluate the extent question, your answer could be, yes, it did. Totally change politics during this time period. The answer could be, it didn't really have any effect whatsoever, that we didn't really see any political change during this time period. Or it could be, well, in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. That's the evaluate the extent. Those are very common questions for the College Board. And they really kind of want you to lean into the, in some ways, yes, in some ways, no, but more on that next slide. So anyway, your thesis is directly answering the prompt. And your thesis should introduce the 3 topics of your 3 supporting paragraphs. So you've already organized your documents into 3 general topics. You know that those 3 topics are going to be your 3 supporting paragraphs. So your thesis should directly identify and name what those 3 supporting paragraphs are going to be. So that when your reader gets to supporting paragraph 1, they're not in any suspense about what it's going to be about. You've already told them in the thesis what it's going to be. And then they get to supporting paragraph number 2, it should be very predictable what that's going to be about because you've already told them in your thesis. And then when they get to supporting paragraph number 3, of course, no surprises there either. You've already told them in your thesis. You need a layout in your thesis, A, B, and C. So in my Aladdin example, Aladdin is the single greatest Disney movie of all time because it has the best soundtrack out of any Disney movie. The genie is the most, funny sidekick of any Disney, whatever. And, Jafar has great facial hair, whatever it is, right? And I'm saying that in my thesis. And then when I get to my supporting paragraphs, I'm really going to kind of like open those up. So the way I like to say this is your thesis is where you state your argument. And then your supporting paragraphs is where you make your argument. But there's a direct connection between thesis and supporting paragraphs, right? Okay. So you want to be specific in your thesis. You want to mention specific historical evidence and in your thesis. So you don't want to be like, okay, well, there was some big change at the federal level, some big change at the state level, but not so much change at the local level. You want to also drop some kind of more specific language than that. So it'd be, we saw some significant change in the opportunities that everyday Americans had at affecting government at the state level through, recall initiative, whatever. So putting in specific points that you will then bring up and expand on in your supporting paragraphs, that is important. The number 1 single worst thing you could possibly do for a thesis, which will make the people who are reading your essay throw up all over themselves and give you a 0, is that you just restate the prompt. You just say it again. And I know that you think you're clever enough to restate it by just like using a thesaurus and changing the words around and they won't notice, but that's not good enough. You have to actually create a historically defensible argument, not just repeating what they said. So again, if the prompt is, sorry, I keep going back to this slide because I didn't include the prompt on the next one. Evaluate the extent to which the progressive movement fostered political change in the United States from 1890 to 1920. And your thesis is the progressive movement fostered significant political change in the United States from 1890 to 1920. That's not a thesis. That is not a thesis, right? Now, the thing that you should be thinking of your thesis is this. You need to put forth a historically defensible argument. In other words, you need to make an assertion that people can disagree with. So if you say your thesis out loud and it sounds like it's just a statement of fact, then that's not good enough. You need to have a thesis that someone could disagree with, right? You need to have a thesis that we can say, well, I don't know about that actually. I might make the argument of that, blah, 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 because that's the whole thing. Your thesis is setting up the entire essay. This is the foundation upon which your entire house will be built. And so if it's an argumentative essay and you don't make an argument in your thesis, then you're setting yourself up for failure the whole way through. So again, if you were to say something along the lines of, like I said, like, you know, the progressive movement was an important moment in American history because we saw significant changes in the way that the government operated and related to the American people. That is just a historical fact. That's not something someone can't come along and say, I don't think that progressivism was an important moment in American history. That's a historical fact, well established, right? So you really need to say something more along the lines of, just something that's more historically defensible. I don't know if I'm going to be able to come with something that great off the top of my head right now, but something where someone can actually disagree, where you can say, in some ways it actually wasn't all that. I don't necessarily always just go with a positive bias. If somebody says, yes, there was great change, you can say, actually, I don't think there was. Or you can say there was in some category, in some ways, and not in other ways, right? So if we tried a different prompt that said something, to what extent was did the American Revolution actually change society? And if your thesis was the American Revolution led to significant changes in American society, that's one, just repeating the prompt, and it's not really actually making an argument. But if you said, politically, the United States was transformed significantly from a monarchy to a republic. However, economically and culturally, the United States actually did not see that much change, as the general power structures outside of politics remain the same. So now someone can be like, well, wait a minute, okay, I think that they did actually change in this way and that, right? So now you're making it a little bit more complicated. Okay, so there are two ways that you could format your thesis. One is good and the other one is better, but sometimes good is good enough, and I'll explain that more in a second. Now, the easy, straightforward way to format your thesis is X because of topic A, topic B, and topic C. So X being your assertion, right? So the United States experienced significant political change in the time period of 1890 to 1920 because A, B, and C. Here are the three reasons why. And those three reasons, again, I'll remind you, are established by your evaluation of the documents. You looked at all the documents and you said, okay, I got one topic out of these couple documents, I got another topic out of these couple documents, I got another topic out of these couple documents. So you're basically making your assertion X because of A, B, and C. This thing is true because A, B, and C. And that's what I keep using in my example with Aladdin. Aladdin's the single greatest Disney movie of all time because this reason, this reason, this reason. That's a good thesis. You are stating a historically defensible argument, and you are clearly laying out what your three supporting paragraphs are going to be about, so the reader will know what is coming when they see it. A better one is one where you include a counter argument to your argument. So if you recognize that there is potentially a counter argument to what you are saying, but you don't think it's good enough to actually undermine your overall argument, you can include that in your essay and include that in your thesis. And that's the best way to go about doing it. So that would look more like, although topic A, X because of B and C. So you're saying, I recognize that there is some evidence to the contrary. However, I still think this is true because of topic B and C. So let me give you a different prompt, for example. If the question was, to what extent did Reconstruction guarantee equal rights for all Americans in the 80s and 1890s or something like that, you can say, although there were three amendments to the Constitution guaranteeing constitutional equality to the freedmen. That's your, okay, there's a counter argument, but here's my argument. Reconstruction did not guarantee equality for all Americans because there was no economic opportunity provided for the freedmen, and because the Southern states effectively undermined those three Reconstruction amendments. So you're looking at a situation in which the documents you were given show you, okay, here's the 13th Amendment. Okay, yes, there was some significant, change made when it came to equal rights for African Americans. And here's some of the work of the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay, cool. So there's a couple of documents here that do show that things were better. But then the rest of the documents are about, sharecropping, or about, maybe a letter, maybe it's a black code, right? That demanded that people work on agricultural. So you can talk about sharecropping. Maybe it's a letter that a slave wrote, or a former slave wrote to one of his relatives in the North, describing his situation. Or maybe it's some of the grandfather text from the grandfather clause, or maybe it's a speech given by a leader of the Ku Klux Klan. So all of the rest of the documents show you that there's a lot of things that really actually didn't make things equal for African Americans. So you could, in that situation, say, although yes, there were some gains made, granted, I would say overall, actually, things were not all that much better, or at least we did not achieve full equality for African Americans, because here's all this evidence to the contrary. Now, when do you choose to do the good thesis versus the better thesis? It all depends on the documents they give you. Don't go for the better thesis if the documents aren't there for it. If all the documents that are laid out for you lead you down one specific direction to make one specific argument, then use that first one, X because of A, B, and C. But if you're looking at the documents and you say, a couple of these documents seem to be contributing to a counter argument, right? But the rest of them seem to be contributing to a larger argument. Then you can start thinking about that topic, and thinking about the better thesis. And if you could set up your entire essay that way, that's going to be a more nuanced essay that is going to be better appreciated by the readers. But if you try to force that when it's not there, you're going to twist yourself into knots and come out looking like a pretzel, and your essay will not be good. So my advice is, don't go in thinking, well, I'm going to do this one or that one. Read the documents and see where the documents lead you. Let the documents be your guide, right? So once, look at all 7 documents, divide them into 3 different categories, and then look at what those categories have, lay it out before you, and then say, okay, I think I could actually include a counter argument here that I could then smack down with my better argument. Or, nope, it's just one straight thing. So, one analogy I like to use in this situation, and I'll kind of come back to it a couple times over and over again, is if you really think of yourself as a prosecuting attorney in a murder trial, right? Like, your job is to prove to the jury that John killed, Bob, right? And you need to make that argument. Now, there could be a pretty believable argument by the defense, right? That John, for whatever reason, that John was, so John killed Bob, right? So let's say that John was, Bob's. Now I'm twisting myself into a pretzel trying to think of an example of this. But my point being, if there is some solid counter argument, right? Bob's girlfriend said she was with John playing miniature golf at the time when the murder happened, or whatever it was, right? You should acknowledge that. And then you should say, well, okay, so there's evidence because she was able to bring receipts of going to miniature golf or whatever, but that doesn't actually fully prove the thing, because that miniature golf receipt said it happened at 4:18 p.m. The murder happened at 6:30 p.m. and there's plenty of time to finish miniature golf and get to the place where the murder happened. Something like that, right? So you acknowledge that there is some counter argument, but then you want to smack it down and say that my overall arguments are more powerful than the counter argument. Again, only if there is evidence being presented to that effect. It would be silly if you were a prosecuting attorney and the defense didn't even bring up the alibi, and you were like, well, you know, it should be noted that his girlfriend says she was miniature golfing with him. Why would you even bring that up? If there's no evidence there, then don't even worry about it. Just go with your argument, right? So if the evidence given to you is clearly pointing to one thing, then do X because of A, B, and C. If they give you a couple of documents that make you feel like you can kind of swing for a home run, then go for the although topic A, X because of B and C. So you have one full paragraph where you're talking about the Reconstruction Amendments and how that did do a lot. But then you're going to go into topics B and C, and you're going to talk about how other things that happened discount what you talked about in that other paragraph. Now, again, that although topic A, X because of B and C is a home run. Sometimes it's good to go for a home run. Sometimes it's good to go for a base hit. You can still get a perfect score with a base hit. Okay, all right. Now let me show you some examples of theses that I wrote for this prompt, 3 of which are bad, 1 of which is good. Okay, so thesis number 1 says, so let me remind you of the prompt. Evaluate the extent to which the progressive movement fostered political change in the United States from 1890 to 1920. Okay, thesis number 1. So I've already done my contextualization. I've already talked about how, you know, okay, the Republican Party was corrupt, and, you know, the government basically was kind of MIA, and they let the captains of industry run the show, and it led us to this Gilded Age, and there's a strong sense that we needed a stronger, more active government to rein in the excesses of blah, 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 blah. All right. So my first thesis, after I've done that contextualization, is the progressive movement was an important time in American history because it brought about a lot of change in the United States. Terrible thesis. That thesis sucks. It does not actually assert any claim. There is no argument there. All I'm saying is that progressivism was important and it brought about change. It just states a fact. It also doesn't identify the theme, right? I didn't talk about politics. I didn't even necessarily speak to that time period. It's so bland and really just me. It's not even me copying the prompt. It's me copying the prompt and deleting 2 of the most important pieces of the prompt. So that's a bad thesis. Another bad thesis. It sounds a little bit better, but I'll explain to you why it's bad. Between the years 1890 and 1920, the progressive movement successfully achieved many goals, such as promoting public education, fighting for access to birth control, and establishing immigrant assimilation. Now, actually, that's a good thesis. It's just a good thesis for a different prompt, because the thing that I already identified to you is that if you read the prompt carefully, you will know that the theme of the prompt is political change. None of the things I talked about in that thesis related to political change. Those are all things that the progressive movement did. Those are all things that indicate that the progressive movement had significant impacts. Now, if the question had been evaluate the extent to which the progressive movement fostered cultural change or societal change or social change, then yeah, maybe public education, birth control, and immigrant assimilation would make sense. But none of those things have to do with politics. So this is why you have to read the question very carefully, because if you just read that prompt super quick and said, evaluate the extent to which progressive movement fostered change in the States in 1898, okay, I know that they fought for public education, I know they fought for birth control, I know they fought for immigrant assimilation, I'm gonna write about that, your entire essay is going to be wrong. Because your thesis is wrong, your thesis is the foundation for the entire essay, you have 3 paragraphs about things that are not political. So that's a good thesis, it's just a good thesis for a different prompt. Okay, thesis number 3, the progressive movement fostered significant political change in the United States from 1890 to 1920. Now, what I did in this third one is different than what I did in the first one. In the first one, I didn't mention political change. I didn't mention the time period. So in the third one I did, that's better, but I still didn't make an argument. I just repeated the prompt. I didn't establish, and I also, in thesis number 1 and thesis number 3, I didn't establish my 3 topics. Thesis number 2, I established 3 topics. They were just for the wrong theme, right? So thesis number 4 is really going to it's going to be a base hit. It's not going to be a home run, and I'll explain that in a second too. But it's going to be a base hit. Thesis number 4. Between the years 1890 and 1920, the progressive movement successfully created political transformations in the United States by reforming local government institutions, creating more power for the people in state government, and refocusing the federal government to control powerful corporations. That's a good thesis. So first thing I did is I made a historically defensible argument. The progressive movement did successfully create political transformations, right? Now someone can come along and say, well, I don't know that they did. And I'm saying that they did. And I'm giving 3 areas that they did. And those are going to be my 3 supporting paragraphs. I'm very clearly setting up my 3 supporting paragraphs here. So I say, between these years, blah, 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 the progressive movement successfully created political transformations in the United States by A, reforming local government institutions. That's what my first supporting paragraph is going to be about. B, creating more power for the people in state governments. That's what my second paragraph is going to be about. And C, focusing the federal government to control powerful corporations. This is my third paragraph is going to be about. And I did not just make those up. I will tell you again, the reason I said reforming local government institutions is because there's a couple documents on that. Now, I don't have the documents anywhere in here, but you just have to believe me that there are documents there. There are a couple documents that focus on reforming local government institutions. There are also a couple documents that focused on creating more power for the people in state government. There were also a couple documents that focused on refocusing the federal government to control powerful corporations. So I've set up my 3 supporting paragraphs. I have document evidence that I'll be able to actually support each of those claims in my supporting paragraphs. This is a good thesis. Now, let me say the reason I didn't do the home run. I didn't do although A, X because of B and C. And it's specifically, as I said before, because the documents didn't set me up for that. Let's say that, and this isn't true, but let's say that there was huge progressive change at the local level and at the state level, but at the federal level, that just never happened. Let's say that Teddy Roosevelt never became president, and let's say that it never happened there, but it did happen at the state and the local level. Then I would go for that, although A, X because of B and C, because there would be some documents that showed, wow, there's a lot of change at the local level in cities. Whoa, there's a lot of change at the state level. And then there'd be some documents that showed there was no change at the federal level. So I would say something along the lines of, although the federal government maintained their position as being supportive of business interests, the progressive movement still was an effective movement at bringing political change at the local and state levels in terms of blah, 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 right? I would have done that if the document set me up for that, but that's not really what that's not really what the history was of the time. And so the documents don't set me up for that. So the documents set me up for a base hit. So I went for a base hit. Okay, so that's what I have to say about the thesis. I'm sure I'll mention the thesis again as further on in the documents, but I know that's a lot for 1 point, but the whole thing's out of 7 points. So if you've done your contextualization, right? If you did the previously on, and then you lead up to the thesis, and then you do your thesis, you do all of the things that you're supposed to do, you will have earned 2 of your 7 points. So contextualization says, put this topic in context, talk about the things that happened before this topic, the more recent, the better, and make sure they're relevant. So make sure they're about politics and not about something else. There's a lot of things that you could talk about that happened in the 1860s and 70s that did not lead to political change, right? So why would you talk about the Civil War before you talked about political change? You wouldn't. So you talk about political stuff. So you've done that. Then you bring it to your thesis and you're putting forth a historically defensible argument, and you are not simply repeating the prompt, and you are including the 3 topics of your 3 supporting paragraphs in the prompt. All right, moving on. Now, how do you get your points for evidence? There are 2 different ways that you get points for evidence. One is your use of the documents, and the other is outside evidence. First, I'm going to talk about use of documents on this slide, then I'll talk about outside evidence on another slide. You get 2 points for your use of documents. Now, you need to have this in each of your supporting paragraphs. If you have 3 supporting paragraphs, 3 different topics, each topic supports your thesis, every single one of the supporting paragraphs should have at least 1 document in it as evidence. If you
Okay, sorry if that was an awkward break right there. I had to pause for a little while, and now I'm back. And I also kind of forgot where I left off. So I'm pretty sure I was talking about that when you establish your 3 supporting paragraphs, once you've established your 3 topics, all of which is based on the documents that you're given, because at the very beginning of the process, you're going to evaluate the documents, you're going to go through them, you're going to organize them into 3 categories. Then you have your 3 supporting paragraphs. You should not have any supporting paragraphs that are absent a document. You should have your documents equal. Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be equally distributed, but there has to be at least one in a supporting paragraph. I think a full supporting paragraph with no documents, not a good situation. So you'll have 7 documents, and it could be you have 322. It could be you have 421. It could be a 511. That would probably be kind of weird, but it's okay, I guess. But certainly you can't have like 4-3 and then none. Like, you definitely need to make sure that you have documents in all 3 of your supporting paragraphs. You should not be using documents in your intro. You should not be using documents in your conclusion. Okay, so let's talk about what you're going to do with those documents, right? You get 1 point for describing the document. Then you get 1 point for explaining how the document supports your thesis. And you have to do this with all 7 documents. Now, I'll be honest with you. Technically, you only have to use 6 of the 7 documents, but I'm going to strongly encourage you to use all 7, because that way, if you misinterpret one of the documents, or your explanation or your description is off, then you still have room for error, and you still get the points for having all 6. I would say you just aim for using all 7. Now, if there's one of them and you're like, this might as well be in Polish, I have absolutely no idea what it says, you have to leave one out. Okay, don't try to make something up and force it if it doesn't work. But if you feel like you at least have some semblance of a grasp on what the document is about, use all 7 documents. So anyway, for each document, you need to describe the document, and you need to explain how your document supports your thesis. Again, this is the evidence. So if we're going back to our analogy that you are a prosecuting attorney in a murder trial, this is the physical evidence that you have to prove that John murdered Bob, right? And they give it to you. It's like, before, when the trial first gets started and you're doing your background research, someone comes with a box and just says, here you go. And it's literally all the evidence you need. There's like a bloody knife with the murderer's fingerprints on there. There's a videotape that shows the murder happening in the parking lot of the 7-Eleven where it happened. There's a bloody shirt that was in the closet of the murder. Like, all of the things that very clearly lay out that the murderer actually committed the murder. Someone hands you those things. Now, it's your job to use those to convince the jury, or in this case, the reader, that the evidence does prove it. So it's not good enough just to describe the evidence. You have to also then explain how it supports your thesis. So in the analogy, your thesis is John killed Bob. So if you just say, look, I have a bloody knife, and then you move on to, look, I have a videotape, and then you move on to, look, I have a bloody shirt, none of those are really that convincing. You don't just describe the evidence, you have to explain it. This knife was found in the dumpster behind the 7-Eleven where the murder happened. It has the blood of the victim, and it has the fingerprints of the murderer. This videotape was taken from the security camera at 7-Eleven, starting at this time, ending at this time, when the coroner documented the time of death. And it clearly shows, although it's not very clear, someone that's about the same height and build as the defendant, standing above the person in the parking lot, stabbing them to death. And here's this bloody shirt was found in the garbage or the closet or whatever of the murder, and it has the blood. Forensics have come back to show that it's the victim's blood. So all of those things put together tells you a story that you're supporting your thesis that John killed Bob, right? You can't just have the evidence in there without explaining it. You have to describe it, and you have to explain it, right? So, by the way, quick side note, there's a typo right here. It says you get 2 points for explaining the documents. That's not true. That was based on last year's, and I missed that when I was updating the presentation. Sorry. So you get 1 point for describing the document, and then you get 1 point for explaining it. When you describe the document, that should be 1 sentence. When you explain the document, that should be 2 sentences. So when you're doing a supporting paragraph, the first thing you should do in your supporting paragraph is have a topic sentence. Of course, I'm sure you're all familiar with what topic sentences are, but it's basically kind of like what some people call a mini thesis. In your overall thesis, in your intro paragraph, you say, here's my argument, and here's what my basically my three topics are going to be that I'm going to support my argument with. Each one of those then is one of your supporting paragraphs. So your very first sentence should be you telling the reader, hey, here's where I'm going to talk about this. Now, obviously, you don't literally use that language. Here's where I'm going to talk about this. But if we go back to my thesis of between the years, blah, 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 progressive movement successfully created political transformations in the United States by reforming local government institutions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. My topic sentence for my first paragraph would be, during the progressive era, many local government institutions were reformed through the, through the advocacy of reformers or something like that. But the point being, I'm letting you know in that very first sentence, this is where I'm going to talk about local government reform. Okay, that's what I'm talking about. So topic sentence. Then immediately after you do topic sentence, you jump into your document. So then immediately you say, you do a one sentence description of your document. So basically, you could say document one shows, and then you say basically overall description of the document. Now, you don't have to, well, I'll get to that in a second. So you could have, there's two ways you could do that. You could either say document one show. So let's say document one, for example, is a local ordinance passed in New York that said, there's a requirement for, health and safety standards within the workplace or something like that, whatever, it's some local piece of legislation. So you could say document one is, a local ordinance from New York that basically just say what it is, right? Or you could just say, New York passed a series of ordinances that blah, 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 blah. And at the end of that sentence, you could put parentheses doc one. So there's two different ways you could do that. But basically, you want to clearly say which document you're talking about. So you either say in document one, blah, 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 or as it shows in document one, blah, 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 blah. Or you just describe it. And then at the end of the sentence, you put parentheses doc one or document one, right? Now, let me say something very clearly right now. You should not ever quote the documents. Do not ever quote the documents. The reader does not need you to quote the documents. The people who are reading your essays and grading them have read these documents multiple times. They know them inside and out. It is a waste of your time to quote the documents. It's a waste of space in your essay. And it kind of looks like you don't know what you're doing, because the reader is going to interpret that as you don't have enough to say for yourself, so you're just quoting the documents and using that as a crutch. So do not ever quote the documents. All you have to do is when you just get to document one or document four, whichever document you're using first, to as evidence for your first point or your first topic, you say, as it shows in document one, blah, 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 blah. Then you explain how that supports your thesis, right? So your explanation should be one or two sentences of how that document supports your thesis. So if your thesis is, as we said a moment ago, that there were that the progressive era reformed local government institutions. Actually, let's not use that one, because my mind is more focused on the creating more power for the people in the state government. So creating more powerful people in state government, right? So then let's say one of the documents is a California state ordinance or state law that allowed for the recall, or let's say a speech was given by a progressive leader that says we need to be able to recall our government officials, or so on and so forth. So you would say Doc 4 shows a speech given by progressive leader John Smith discussing why the recall is so important to cleaning up, corruption in politics and giving more power to the people. So that's your description of the document. So you either said, as it says in Doc 4, and then you do that, or as Doc 4 shows, or Doc 4 is, or something like that, and then you describe it. Then your explanation is, this shows that, right, or that there was multiple efforts and attempts, successful of multiple efforts and attempts at giving more power to the people, and therefore creating more political change during this time period. So you're going back to that political change question. You're being very explicit at saying how this document supports it. So you do, again, one sentence describing the document, 1 to 2 sentences telling how that document then supports your thesis. And in between those 2 sentences, you should use a word that connects the two. So therefore, as a result, or given that, or consequently, or for that reason, because you're basically saying, here's the document, and you're saying, therefore, or as a result, basically saying this then supports my overall thesis. Everything should always point back to your overall thesis. If you're talking about evidence and it's going off in some other random direction, that's not good. Everything should always point back to your thesis, because that's ultimately what you're trying to do, is convince people of your point. And just in case you miss it the first time, do not ever quote the documents. So when you're doing your, let's say that you've gone at the beginning of the whole process, you've gone through your documents and you decided, okay, there are 2 documents in this collection of documents that support the idea of creating more power for the people in the state government. Document 4 and document 5, right? So you've done your topic sentence, and then for document 1, you go describe the document and then explain how it supports your thesis. And then you're going to do something else with that document, which we'll explain later on. And then you move into document 5 and you describe the document as this is in document 5, or according to doc 5, or blah, 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 quote, parentheses, doc 5. And then you explain that document, how it supports your thesis, and then you're done. You get out. You don't need to figure out some way to close the sentence, the paragraph. You don't need a transitionary sentence to get to the next paragraph. Once you've done both things for each of the documents that you plan to use. So if you have 2 documents in that paragraph, you do that twice. If you have 3 documents in that paragraph, you do that 3 times. That's basically all you're doing. Topic sentence, and then you do everything you need to do with document number 4, and then you do everything you do with document number 5, and then you're out. Unless you have a 3rd document for that one, then everything you need to do for document number 7 or whatever, right? So that's basically what you need to do with the documents. First, describe the document. Second, and make sure you explicitly state which document you're describing. Doc 1 says, or according to doc 1, or blah, 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 parentheses, doc 1. And then, therefore, as a result, or consequently, or this shows that, or, you know what I mean? And then you want to be explicit that you are talking about how document 1 supports the idea of political change. Use that term, political change, because that's the term that this whole thing kind of centers around. So that's what you're doing with the documents. You do that with all 7 documents. You'll do 2, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 in supporting paragraph number 1. You do a couple in supporting paragraph number 2. You do a couple supporting paragraph number 3. This is going to make up, most of what your supporting paragraphs are going to be, is just kind of making your way through these documents. If you do all that, you will get those 2 points for the use of documents. 1 point for describing the document, and 1 point, cross this out, this is a typo, 1 point for explaining how the documents support your thesis. If you do that with all 7 documents, you will get those 2 points. Okay, so at this point, you've gotten 4 out of the 7 points, because you got a point for contextualization at the beginning of the intro paragraph. You got a point for the thesis at the end of the intro paragraph. And going through your next 3 paragraphs, your supporting paragraphs, you have described a document and explained the document for every single document. So you've gotten those 2 points. So right now you're at a 4 out of 4. Okay. The 3rd evidence point comes from what we call outside evidence. So how do you get the 1 point for use of outside evidence? Well, they also want you to bring in stuff that you know about that time period that supports the thesis that is not from the documents. So you have to use the documents, and then they want you to bring in 1 more thing. So for each supporting paragraph, you have to come up with 1 more thing that you are aware of that supports that point, right? So if you're in supporting paragraph number, if you're in the 2nd supporting paragraph, which I'll go back again, and the focus of that is creating more power for the people in state government, right? And so let's say there was 1 document that talked about, the initiative, and 1 document that talked about the recall, and none of the documents talked about the 17th Amendment, right? So the 17th Amendment, prior to the 17th Amendment, not state senators, but senators were chosen by the state legislature. And after the 17th Amendment, it allowed for people to have direct election of their senators. So that was not included in any of the documents. So now you are going to bring that in. So after you've done everything you need to do with, let's say, the documents that apply to this paragraph are doc 4 and doc 6. You've done everything you need to do with document 4. You've done everything you need to do with document 6. Now you're going to bring in your outside evidence. And this really only needs to be about 1 or 2 sentences. What you need to do is you need to do 3 things with that evidence. 1, name it, 17th Amendment. So the 17th Amendment was also an important piece of creating more power for people within state government, right? Explain what it is, because it allowed for the direct election of senators, and then describe how it supports your thesis. This, of course, well, maybe not say of course, but this also leads to the idea of political change. Prior to this time period, senators were chosen by the state legislature. After this time period, as a result of the 17th Amendment, senators were chosen by the people. So that represents political change, right? So all you need to do is name the thing, whatever it might be, explain what it is. So 17th Amendment led to the direct election of senators, and this is an example of political change. So you've done document 4, you've done document 6, you brought in your own outside evidence. You only need 1 piece of outside evidence for each of your 3 supporting paragraphs. So all in all, you only need 3 pieces of outside evidence, 1 for supporting paragraph number 1, 1 for supporting paragraph number 2, and 1 for supporting paragraph number 3. And this basically is just like any key term you could think of that really, and this is why we've done a lot of focus on key terms throughout the year, that applies to this, that can help you make the point of that paragraph that supports your thesis. But just to be clear, it cannot be something that is mentioned in the documents at all. It has to be something completely unrelated to the documents. So if you could do that 3 times, 1 for supporting paragraph 1, 1 for supporting paragraph 2, and 1 for supporting paragraph 3, you will get that 1 point. So if you've done all the stuff you need to do with the documents as far as describe the document and explain how it supports your thesis. So 2 to 3 sentences for each document, right? For describing the document, how it supports your thesis. If you've done 1 to 2 sentences per paragraph based on the outside information, and in those 1 to 2 sentences, you named the piece of evidence, you explained what it is, and you described how it supports your thesis, then you've gotten all of those points. Okay, so that's the evidence. So now you're at a 5 out of 5. There's only 2 points left. The first one of those last 2 points is kind of one of the most complicated pieces of the DBQ. It's actually seemingly complicated, but it's not all that complicated. So basically this comes from the analysis and reasoning. So this is the analysis piece of the analysis and reasoning part of the scoring kind of rubric, right? And so you get this 1 point by sourcing the document. I'm also going to refer to it as HIPPing the document. Now, HIPP is an acronym, HIPP, and you'll see below what it stands for. Now, I will, as a side note, say that when I did a Google search for GIFs related to HIPP, most of them were people dancing in a way that was inappropriate for school. So I found this one, which seems more appropriate and also, you know, gets the point across. HIPP. Anyway, so in where does HIPP go, right? So if contextualization and the thesis go in the introductory paragraph, if all of your evidence goes in supporting paragraphs 1, 2, and 3, where does HIPP go? HIPP also goes in supporting paragraphs 1, 2, and 3, and it's going to kind of be also mixed in with your work on the documents. So let's go back to the idea of kind of like the basic kind of construction of a supporting paragraph. The first thing you're going to do is put a topic sentence. Then you're immediately going to dive into your documents, and you're going to, as we said on the last in the last section, you're going to explain the document. You're going to describe the document and then explain how it supports your thesis. And then before you move on to the next document, you're going to HIPP that document. So again, if you're in if you're in the 3rd paragraph of your essay, the 2nd supporting paragraph, and you're focusing on how people got more power or got more of a voice in local government, and you've one of the documents there very clearly shows, you know, like I said, someone's giving a speech about how important it is that we have recall elections or initiatives or something, referendums or something like that, and you've used that document as evidence to support that idea. So you've described what the document is, and then you've explained how it supports your thesis. Before you move on to the next document, you have to HIPP that document. You will HIPP every single one of the documents in your essay, right? So you have 7 documents. For each one of those 7 documents, you will describe it, you will explain it, and then you will HIPP it, or you will source it, right? So what does that mean? You must describe and explain the source of each document using the HIPP method. So what does this acronym mean? So you only have to do one of these four things. You don't have to do all four of these for each document, but for each document, you have to do one of these four things. You either have to explain the historical context of that document, or explain the intended audience of that document, or explain the purpose of that document, or explain the point of view of that document. You don't have to do all of those things, but you have to do one of those things for all 7 documents. Now, it could be that you do the same thing for all 7 documents. You could do historical context for all 7 documents, or purpose for all 7 documents, or you could do historical document for, or historical context for document number 1, intended audience for document number 2, point of view for document number 3, et cetera, et cetera. You could do it however you want, but you have to do one of these. So what does each one of these mean? So for historical context, you have to talk about what led to the creation of this document, or what did this document lead to? Okay, so what led to the creation of the document, or what did this document lead to? So let's use this made-up document that I keep referring to. So you're in your 3rd paragraph of your essay, your 2nd supporting paragraph, you're using document number 4, which is a speech given by a California progressive politician who is advocating for allowing the people of California to be able to recall elected officials who they think should be removed from office prior to the election, right? So you've described that document, great. You've explained how the document supports your thesis, cool, and now you have to HIPP it. So if you were going to use historical context, you would say, what led to the creation of this document? So you would say, the historical context of this document is, you want to be that clear and straightforward. You don't want to be vague. You don't want to be cute or coy. You want to explicitly say the historical context of this document is, there was, or corruption was widespread in government at all levels during this time period. And the progressive movement wanted to give people the power to remove people from office who were corrupt. Just that in and of itself. So you're explaining why, what the historical context is, why that document exists. Why did the College Board give you that document, right? That the reason that recall was so important in that time period is because the entire focus was to try to clean up the corruption in the system. So you very explicitly say the historical context of this document is, or you could say the intended audience of this document is. So that basically is, who was this document created for and why? So again, if it's a politician in California giving a speech in the state legislature to other politicians, you would say the intended audience of this document is the state legislature who Assemblyman John Smith was trying to convince to pass this piece of legislation. So you're just telling the reader, I know who this document was created for, right? Or if you use an outside example, let's say it was Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. The intended audience of Uncle Tom's Cabin was basically Americans who lived in the North, who she wanted to make aware of, the brutality of slavery, yada, 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 right? So basically that's another option you could do. A third option is, what is the purpose of this document? Now, it's kind of similar to intended audience, but if the document, again, is a California politician trying to convince the rest of the state legislature to adopt this piece of legislation to allow for the recall, well, that's what you would say. You would say the purpose of this document is that Assemblyman John Smith wants to try to get the recall passed so that the people of California have more power to be able to root out corrupt politicians. So it's kind of similar to intended audience. The difference is, who are they talking to in intended audience? The purpose is, what are they hoping to accomplish? Point of view, I would say, is kind of the most tricky one, and I would stay away from that one if I were you, but if you want to use it, you can. Point of view is basically, who created the document and how does who they are influence what they have to say about the topic. So I'm going to use an example outside of the progressive era one because I think it's a little bit cleaner. But let's say that there was a document and you read it, and and it was a letter that was written to President Eisenhower about how important it was to support the desegregation of schools, or how important, or basically it was about desegregation, right? And it's going to make a big difference if that letter was written by the NAACP, who obviously supports the desegregation of schools, or if that letter was written by someone from the Ku Klux Klan, who's obviously the opponent of the desegregation of schools. So point of view would just be very clearly the fact that this letter is from the NAACP is going to influence the fact that, you know, what their perspective is and what they're trying to accomplish, and you'd explain how, versus if it was someone from the KKK. So that one's a little bit tricky because it's kind of like you have to, you know, in certain situations, you have to try to guess who that person is influences what they have to say about a thing. Historical context, intended audience, and purpose to me seem a lot cleaner. But again, this is a document by document situation. Every single document will present itself to you and you'll read it, and there'll be, each document will have its own, it'll be clear to you for each document which of these things makes the most sense. Now you could go into this just saying, I'm going to make it easy on myself. I'm just going to, just to make everything simple, I'm just going to explain the historical context for all of the documents. That's fine, totally fine. Or you can kind of look at the documents and just see how that lays itself out. But the point being, for every single document, you have to do one of these, not all four, one of these, right? So again, you want to make sure you're being very explicit in your language. As it says, either the historical context of document 4 is, or the intended audience of document 4 is, or the purpose of document 4 is, or the point of view of, right? And you could say document 4, or you could say, you know, of, you know, the historical context of the speech given by Assemblyman John Smith is, or the intended audience of this speech given by Assemblyman John Smith is, or the purpose of the speech, or the point of view of Assemblyman John Smith. But say that explicitly, okay? Say that explicitly. So again, if you're going to look at the kind of the anatomy of a supporting paragraph, it starts with topic sentence, then it goes to immediately into your first document. The first document, you're going to describe what it is. Document 4 is a speech given by blah, blah, blah. Explain why it supports your thesis. This supports my thesis because, or you don't have to say this supports my thesis because, but you say this clearly shows that there was a political change during this time period because we see that more and more, that the people are getting more and more power and influence in local politics. And then you're going to talk about the historical context, or you're going to talk about one of these, HIPP, right? So you could basically do historical context and say the historical context of this document was. So once you've described a document, explain how it supports your thesis, and source that document or HIPP to that document, then you can move on to the next document. And then for that document, you describe, explain how it supports your thesis, and then you HIPP it. And then if you have another document, you do it again. But once you're done with the documents for that paragraph, you go to the next paragraph. Well, sorry, step back. Once you've done that for each of the documents, then you come and you bring in your outside evidence. Then at the end of the paragraph, you bring your outside evidence. Then you move on to the next paragraph, topic sentence, moving into the documents, and then you do describe, explain, source, or HIPP the document, and then move on to the next one, describe, explain, source the document, and then you do your outside information, and then you move on to the next paragraph. This will become more clear, in case it's not clear, in the video that you're going to watch after this video. Okay, so that's, now you've done all that, you're at a 6 out of 7. You got 6 out of 7 points. And I think I said this way back in the beginning of the video. Maybe I didn't, but I'll say it. Well, I'll say it on the next slide. So the last point that you could possibly, the last point that's available to you is through something called complexity. Now it should be stated, and again, maybe I said this at the beginning, maybe I didn't. Only 2% of AP history students who take the AP test get this point. 98% of students do not get this point. This is a very difficult point to get. Even all of the kind of like YouTube superstar APUSH teachers that have like hundreds of thousands of followers and a bunch of videos, some of whom I rely on a lot to help me understand what College Board is thinking because they understand it better than I do. Most of them don't even know how to get this point. And it seems like it's very, very difficult to do so. But many, many people get 5s on the exam with getting a 6 out of 7 on the DBQ. In other words, you can get a 6 out of 7 on the DBQ and still get a 5. In fact, many people do, because if 98% of people don't get that 7th point, right? So complexity is something that is I would say the one you need to worry about the least, because it's the one that you're least likely to get. And so we're going to put this in our conclusion paragraph for two reasons. One, because if you run out of time just doing your intro and your three supporting paragraphs, and you've done all that correctly, you've gotten 6 out of 7 points, and time's up, and you can move on, and you can still get a 5 on the exam. But also because the only strategy I've heard after watching a lot of YouTube videos from like other AP teachers that are, again, much better at understanding what College Board wants than I am. The best strategy I've heard, the easiest strategy I've heard, is that you try to do this in your thesis. There's a lot of different ways to get to the complexity point. One of the ways to get the complexity point, as an aside, and this doesn't mean you should go for it, but earlier when I was talking about the thesis, and I was saying you could either do the base hit thesis, which is X because of topic A, topic B, topic C, or you could do the home run thesis, which is although topic A, comma, X because topic B, topic C, meaning I'm acknowledging there's a counter argument, but I don't think that counter argument is strong enough to disprove my argument. So I'm going to talk about the counter argument in one of my in one of my paragraphs. Then I'll use the other paragraphs to basically present my argument while also smacking down the counter argument. Again, don't force that if it's not there. Only do that if the documents give that to you. But that's one way I've heard that you could earn the complexity point, is if you do that well and you do that successfully. I wouldn't have made that effort, as I said before, on this DBQ that I'm using as my sample prompt, because the documents weren't there for me, right? As I explained earlier. So if you find yourself in a situation where you feel like the prompt and the document set you up for a topic A counter argument, or although topic A counter argument, comma, X because of B and C, go for it, and you may get the complexity point there. But regardless, the seemingly easiest way to try to get the complexity point is to do so in your concluding paragraph. And basically what you do is you just connect the topic of your essay to another historical period. So let's first just clear ourselves of responsibility of what we usually think a conclusion's for. Usually people think the intro is where you kind of tell people what the essay is going to be about. Then the supporting paragraphs are where you actually make your argument. And the conclusion is where you kind of summarize everything and put a nice bow on it, right? Or so kind of like the more common way people say it is, you tell them what you're going to tell them, you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. Intro, tell them what you're going to tell them. Supporting paragraphs, tell them. And then conclusions, tell them what you told them. Well, you don't need to do that. It's a 5-paragraph essay. You don't need to summarize your essay at all. Don't waste any time summarizing or wrapping it up. You've made all of your points. They got all your points. They scored it as they went. They don't need you to wrap it up. So instead, you could use your conclusion to try to get that complexity point. And you do so by connecting your essay to another historical time period. So that's the easiest way to try to accomplish contextualization. So for example, if you're talking about the progressive era, and this is where you can get outside of the years, right? I told you before, I made it very clear where, okay, if the prompt says 1890 to 1920, stay in that time period. Well, now that you're in your conclusion, all rules are off. And if you're going to that complexity point, then you could look to the future. So then you could do a couple of sentences about FDR and the New Deal, and how that basically built off the ideas of the progressive era, right? And you could say how the progressive era, although it kind of wound down after 1920, that specific era, the ideas of progressivism carried on, and we could see them very clearly in as the core ideas of the New Deal and of the Great Society, and give a little bit of detail and explanation about that. Spend 3 sentences, 4 sentences on that, and that might get you the complexity point, right? Or if the topic was about if it was about Reconstruction, you could then in the concluding paragraph talk about the Civil Rights Movement and how that was basically like an attempt to finish the unfinished work of Reconstruction. So those rules about staying within the timeline they give you are out the window in the concluding paragraph, and that is what I understand, as I've watched many videos on this, to be the easiest way to possibly get that complexity point. So another way to think about this is that the complexity is the inverse of contextualization. So remember, at the very beginning of the essay, contextualization is what are the important things that led to this moment, right? This is the previously on Gilmore Girls, right? Like, what are the things that you need to know to understand the why we needed political change in 1890 and 1920, right? Well, complexity is then what comes afterwards, right? If you're talking about a specific moment in history, at the very beginning of your essay in contextualization, you're going to talk about the things that led to that specific moment. And then at the end of your essay, in your conclusion with complexity, you're going to talk about to what it led to. So same way, sometimes TV shows will give you a preview next week on Gilmore Girls, and they'll kind of give you a little bit of a preview of what's to come. That's kind of what complexity, or that's kind of what you may try to do in your conclusion to earn the complexity point. Again, 98% of people don't get that point. And again, a 6 out of 7 leaves you in really good shape to still get a 5 on the AP test. Most of your attention and focus should go to developing a really good thesis as the foundation of your essay, and then really clearly using all the documents to support your thesis. For each document, for all 7, describe what the document is, explain how it supports your thesis, source the document or HIPP the document, right? So you do that really well. Then for each paragraph, you bring in outside piece of evidence, which you then name, explain, and also or name, describe, and explain in all 3 paragraphs. So if you've done your contextualization, if you've done your thesis, if you've done your document work, if you've done your sourcing the document, if you've done your outside evidence, for every single document you've done the work that you need to do, and you've done outside evidence for all 3 supporting paragraphs, the contextualization or the complexity question is really just an added bonus, right? If you've got 6 out of 7 points, you're on your way to a 5. And you could try for complexity. Again, if you've run out of time and you don't have time for a conclusion, you don't have to have a conclusion. You've still gotten your 6 out of 7 points. You don't lose points for not having a conclusion. There's no rule that says it has to be a 5-paragraph essay. So if you've done your intro, that includes complexity and thesis. You've done your 3 supporting paragraphs that include your describing the document, explaining how it supports your thesis, sourcing the document for all the documents. You've done your outside information, name, describe, and explain. You've got your 6 points, and you don't do complexity, you don't have a conclusion, that's fine. But if you have a little time at the end and you want to try to connect it to some future events or processes or themes, and maybe make an attempt at getting at a complexity point, might as well go for it. Okay, so there's a lot in this video, a lot. There's a companion video to this one that shows you basically kind of how you will outline your DBQs on a document that I will lean into all of the kind of language and things that I used in this essay. I really hope you watched this. I really hope you made it to the end, because I will say again, just being a good writer is not how you get a 5 on these tests. A lot of people will be like, I'm a really good writer, I don't need to worry about that. It's not about being a good writer at all. You can be a really good writer and not do well on this. You could be a pretty okay writer and do very well on this. It's just about knowing the formula and knowing what they expect of you. So if you have any questions about any of this, certainly you can ask me at any point. You can email me. You could do it during the office hours that I'm going to be setting up as we go through the review period. Or if you even wanted to kind of just set up like a one-on-one thing during student support, we could do that. Or if you and some of your friends wanted to do something during student support, we could do that. But we'll be doing a lot of work on DBQs. This is just kind of the intro to what you need to understand. All right. Thank you for your time. I hope this was helpful, and good luck out there.